Hello friends, my name is Bintou and welcome back to my channel. So in today's video, I want to do a book review of the book Not a Crime to Be Poor by Peter Edelman. And I read this book in June 2020 and I talked about it very briefly in my June wrap up, but I want to go into more detail on some of the most important parts of this book because I think that it was a really important book. So the main gist of this book is the author Edelman presents an overview of how being poor in America can lead to this never-ending cycle of entering the criminal justice system and never quite leaving it. And so his point is that poverty is both a cause and a consequence of our current criminal justice system, even though it is technically unconstitutional to make someone pay if they can't afford to, and how there is this underlying layer of racism that is present in every aspect of criminalization in our system. All right, so I like to start my reviews off with a summary, and in the case of this book, I'm just going to present what I consider to be the three most salient points in this book. The first most important point is that minor violations that would only be annoyances for people with means turn out to be disastrous for people who are poor or near poor. And I think this is a really important point because it emphasizes or it underscores the fact that people are, for the most part, being punished, not exactly for their crime, but for their poverty. And he begins with a brief history of how this happened, and it goes back to the Reagan era and the budget cut. And all those budget cuts created revenue gaps in the criminal justice system, and those revenue gaps were shifted onto the users of the court. What this meant was that there was the creation of all these new expensive fees, and also the creation of police quotas or arrest quotas that officers had to meet. And because of all of this, if you got a minor ticket, the actual amount that you pay turns out to be much more than the cost of the ticket itself. And of course, if you're unable to pay these fees, what happens is that in many states across the country, they will suspend your driver's license. And of course, this is an issue because if your driver's license is suspended, you can't get to work. And if you can't get to work, you can't make the money that you need to pay for these fines that you are being told to pay. And if you can't pay those, then they accumulate even more fines and eventually you will end up in jail. Something else that I had no idea is that you are actually charged room and board while you're in jail, which means that while you're jailed for your inability to pay your fines, you're accumulating even more debt that you will owe to the court. And he talks about the fact that many people can end up dying while still owing money to the court. That is mind-blowing. And it really drives home the point that if you are poor, there's really no way out of this unless you have help from people. And you can also see how this affects poor people the most. If I receive a parking ticket, it's an annoyance, but I can pay it and that will be the end of it. But if you can't afford that ticket, this just spirals out of control. The second most salient point that he brings up is the school to prison pipeline. So there are these things called school resource officers who are present in American public schools, but of course disproportionately so in poor schools that have a much higher concentration of kids of color. And these school resource officers can arrest kids and send them to court for behavior that was just previously dealt with in school. And some of these kids are even sent to adult court. In the book, there were children as young as 10 years old that were being sent to court by school resource officers. These kids can potentially be put on probation, and there are fees associated with probation. So the parents then have to pay these fees, or the kids are going into debt. So they end up with a criminal record and debt before they've even graduated high school. There's also the criminalization of truancy, which is basically missing too much school. And he has a few case studies of children who were taken to court and convicted of truancy. And most of these kids were poor children of color, and they had reasons for not being able to go to school. So for example, one kid couldn't get to school because he was homeless, and another kid had severe depression and was able to complete their work from home but not actually show up to school. And another kid was too busy taking care of her mom who had dementia. These kids were convicted as criminals, and they can eventually owe thousands of dollars to the court. And if they're unable to pay that, they can and do become jailed when they turn 17 years old. And even if they're not jailed, having a criminal record will bar access to any grants or financial aid that you can get to attend university in the United States, which means that their higher education is now in jeopardy. And perhaps the biggest irony of it all, and the author points this out, is that school resource officers became more prominent after the Columbine shooting. And specifically, he says that the dangerous rhetoric of super predators and the murders at Columbine High School in Colorado led to zero tolerance policies and brought an enlarged police presence called school resource officers into public schools, with the ironic result that the murder of white suburban children led to punitive policies that hit poor inner city children the hardest. And then the third most important point that he touches on is money bail. So bail is simply making defendants pay a large sum of money in order to ensure that they come back for their court appearances. And the biggest problem with money bail is that the defendants or the arrestees are held in prison while awaiting trial if they cannot make bail, and that length of time can be massive. And what often happens is, in order to avoid being stuck in jail, defendants will plead guilty even if they aren't actually guilty of a crime, just so that they can leave. And this has far-reaching consequences that they may not even be aware of at the time that they're doing it, because once they've pled guilty, they are now convicted of a crime. They're criminals. And this is going to bar access to employment and housing, because a lot of landlords do criminal background checks, and a lot of jobs will ask you if you've been convicted of a crime, and also will potentially do criminal background check. And if this creates a bar to housing and employment, you have now started this cycle of poverty that's going to be really, really difficult to break out of. And something that I didn't know is that the business of money bail is extremely lucrative, and these bail bondsmen are backed by these massive insurance companies, which have great influence. And that's why it's so difficult to see money bail going away anytime soon. He does present some alternatives like community bail funds, and these bail funds are community funded, so people donate to them, and so it helps people get out of prison so they're not just sitting there while waiting trial. And the important thing to note is that, and he says this, rich people make bail and poor people don't. So this is regardless of actual guilt. If you have means, you'll be able to walk and then reappear for trial in order to actually defend your innocence. And there's one example in this book about a young boy who was in Rikers Island, which is a prison in New York City. And he was being held there, waiting for trial for a crime that he didn't actually commit. And because this crime occurred in the Bronx, he was in a system that was extremely crowded, understaffed court, which meant that it was years before his case actually made it to trial. And even after he was released, the effects of being jailed were so severe that he never fully overcame it and eventually committed suicide. So the system of bail in America has far-reaching consequences. And one thing he says, another irony, and I'll read it word for word here. Ironically, when they plead guilty, they receive a sentence of credit for time served and they go home. While they were presumed innocent, they were too dangerous or unreliable to be released, but once convicted, they are sent home. Amazing, isn't it? And then after this, the author does go into more detail on all the other facets that can lead to entrance into the criminal justice system, including mental illness and homelessness. And he ends the book by taking a look at community organizations across the country that are doing the work of keeping people out of jail, or at the very least connecting them with lawyers that can provide them with fair representation so that they aren't convicted of crimes that they're not guilty of. So now I want to talk about some of the strengths of this book. So the first thing that I really liked about this book is that the author does provide alternate solutions to the problems that he's talking about, and he also does provide some evidence for those solutions. So for example, with the problem of money bail, there are two alternate solutions that are far more effective than just keeping people in jail until they can go to trial. And those include letting people out on recognizance, which turns out to be a lot more effective than we are led to believe, or the community-based nonprofit bail funds, which again will pay for the bail of people because they do get that money back once they appear in court. The second strength of this book is that he approaches the problem from so many different facets. Like I mentioned earlier, he talks about all the ways that people end up entering the criminal justice system, whether it's from school, minor tickets and offenses, mental illness, homelessness, not paying child support. This was also touched on in the book, and how all of these things lead to an increase in incarceration, which eventually tends to lead to more and more incarceration over the course of a person's lifetime. The third thing I really liked about this book is that at the end of the book, he does highlight a bunch of community-based organizations in various large cities across the country and highlights their success in preventing people from entering the criminal justice system in the first place, or helping them once they're in it and once they've left it. I thought that was a pretty positive way to end this book, and it also provides hope to the reader that there are solutions out there to this giant problem. And then the fourth thing I liked about this book is that it is highly accessible. So I didn't have too much trouble reading this book. I don't think that the language and the jargon was so severe that I had trouble understanding what the author was talking about. I think that any adult could read this book and walk away with the information that they needed to walk away from it with. As for critiques, I actually personally couldn't think of any. So I went and looked at some reviews and see what other people were saying about what they didn't like about this book. And most people actually didn't have many critiques to give. I found two. And the first one was that one person said that you may need a bit of a background on the criminal justice system, like a small crash course. I personally didn't know much about the criminal justice system before reading this book, and I think he provided definitions where it was necessary. And one other person said it was just too dense. And this book is full of statistics. So if you are someone whose eyes just glass over when a bunch of statistics are presented, then that could be something to watch out for. In conclusion, I gave this book 5 stars. I really enjoyed it, and I definitely learned a lot more about well, my camera died, but basically what I was saying is that I give this book 5 stars, and I highly recommend it if you want more knowledge on the criminal justice system in the United States. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope you do too if you pick it up. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.